The mystery of the corpse. The dense forest of Garanvale had always been shrouded in mystery. For years, locals spoke of strange occurrences, whispers in the wind, sudden drops in temperature, and shadows that moved against the light. But none of these tales prepared them for what was about to unfold. It was a misty morning when two woodcutters, Harold and Peter, ventured deeper into the forest than ever before. They were in search of valuable timber, but what they found was far more chilling. Beneath an ancient oak tree, partially obscured by fallen leaves, lay a corpse. The body was twisted unnaturally, its face frozen in a grimace of sheer terror. "What in God's name?" Peter whispered, his voice trembling. Harold knelt beside the body. The man appeared to be in his 30s, dressed in tattered clothing that looked out of place, almost like it belonged to another era. Most disturbingly, his skin was unnaturally pale, with strange symbols etched into his arms and chest, as though carved with a blade. "We should leave," Harold said, his voice barely audible. "This isn't right." Peter shook his head. "We need to report this to the authorities. This could be murder." Reluctantly, Harold agreed, and the two men hurried back to the village. But as they walked away, neither noticed the faint glow emanating from the symbols on the corpse. The news spread quickly through Garanvale. Sheriff Elias, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for solving even the most perplexing cases, arrived at the scene later that afternoon. He brought with him a team of deputies and the town's doctor, Dr. Beatrix Lang, a woman known for her sharp mind and unshakable demeanor. Dr. Lang examined the body carefully. "These symbols," she murmured, tracing one with a gloved finger. "They're not just random marks. They resemble runes, possibly ancient." Sheriff Elias frowned. "Runes? Like some kind of ritual?" Dr. Lang nodded. "It's possible, but the cause of death is unclear. There are no external wounds that could have killed him. It's as if," she paused, searching for the right words, "as if his life was simply taken from him." The sheriff's unease grew. "We need to figure out who he is and what he was doing out here." The body was transported back to the village for further examination, but as night fell, strange things began to happen. Birds that had roosted in the trees near the oak tree flew away in a frenzy. The air grew heavy, and an unnatural silence blanketed the forest. That night, Harold couldn't sleep. His thoughts kept returning to the corpse and the eerie symbols. He decided to visit Peter, hoping that a few drinks and conversation would ease his mind. But when he arrived at Peter's cottage, he found the door ajar. "Peter!" Harold called out, stepping inside. The house was dark, save for a single candle flickering on the table. The room was in disarray, as though a struggle had taken place. And then he saw it, a note scrawled hastily on a piece of parchment. "They're watching me. Don't trust the forest." A sudden chill ran down Harold's spine. He turned to leave, but a shadow moved across the doorway. For a moment, he froze, his heart pounding in his chest. When he mustered the courage to look again, the shadow was gone. The next morning, Peter's body was found hanging from a tree near the edge of the forest. Like the first corpse, his skin was pale, and symbols were carved into his arms. Dr. Lang delved into old texts and manuscripts, searching for any clue about the symbols. Finally, she uncovered a passage in a forgotten tome that spoke of a cursed ritual practiced by a secretive cult centuries ago. The ritual, it said, involved the extraction of a person's life force to summon an entity from another realm. "Sheriff," she said urgently, "this isn't just a murder case. This is something far older and far darker. If we don't stop it, more lives will be lost." Meanwhile, Harold began to experience strange dreams. He saw the oak tree bathed in blood, its roots writhing like serpents. He heard whispers in an ancient language, promising power and vengeance. Each night, the dreams grew more vivid, and he awoke with a burning sensation on his arms, the same symbols that had been carved into the victims. The villagers, now gripped by fear, began to avoid the forest altogether. But Harold, Dr. Lang, and Sheriff Elias knew they had to confront whatever was causing these deaths. Armed with torches and an old map that marked the site of an ancient altar deep in the woods, they ventured into the heart of Garanvale Forest. As they approached the altar, the air grew colder. The symbols on Harold's arms began to glow faintly, guiding them to the spot. The altar was a grotesque structure of stone and bone, covered in the same runes that adorned the victims. "This is it," Dr. Lang whispered. "This is where the ritual was performed." Before they could act, a shadowy figure emerged from the darkness. It was neither man nor beast, its form shifting and pulsating as though it were made of smoke and fire. Its voice was a low, guttural growl. "You dare disturb my domain?" Harold stepped forward, his fear replaced by a strange determination. "This ends now." The final confrontation was a blur of light and shadow, of ancient words spoken and defied. In the end, the altar was destroyed, and the entity's hold on the forest was broken. But Harold paid the price. The symbols on his arms burned brighter until he collapsed, lifeless, his sacrifice sealing the curse forever. Epilogue. The forest of Garenvale returned to its quiet, eerie self, but the villagers knew better than to venture too deep. The story of the cursed corpse and the brave souls who ended the darkness became legend, a reminder that some mysteries are best left undisturbed. The shadow in the mansion. The old mansion of Blackthorn Hall stood at the edge of the village, looming like a dark sentinel against the crimson hues of the setting sun. For decades, it had been uninhabited, its towering spires and broken windows a source of unease for the villagers. But when the Whitaker family inherited the property, they had little choice but to move in, unaware of the shadowy force that awaited them. Chapter 1. The Arrival. Thomas Whitaker, a middle-aged scholar with an affinity for history, had always dreamed of owning an estate. His wife, Margaret, was less enthusiastic, but their financial troubles left them no alternative. Along with their two children, Eleanor, a bright but introverted teenager, and young Samuel, a curious boy of 10, they arrived at Blackthorn Hall on a rainy afternoon. The house greeted them with an oppressive silence. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint scent of mildew. The furniture, covered in white sheets, seemed to hide secrets of its own. Eleanor shivered as she caught a glimpse of her reflection in a tarnished mirror. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw a shadow move behind her. "It's just the wind," Margaret said, noticing her daughter's unease. But Eleanor wasn't convinced. Chapter 2. The First Night. As night fell, the family settled into their new home. Thomas spent the evening in the study, poring over old books left by the previous owner. Margaret busied herself unpacking, while Eleanor and Samuel explored the house. The children's laughter echoed through the halls, a stark contrast to the mansion's somber atmosphere. But when the clock struck midnight, the laughter ceased. Eleanor, lying awake in her room, felt an inexplicable chill. The shadows cast by the flickering candlelight seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. She heard faint whispers, too soft to understand but too distinct to ignore. Samuel, meanwhile, claimed to have seen a figure standing at the end of the corridor. "It was just a shadow," he told his mother the next morning, but his trembling voice betrayed his fear. Chapter 3. The Presence. Over the next few days, the unease grew. Doors creaked open on their own, and objects seemed to shift positions when no one was looking. Margaret dismissed these incidents as mere coincidences, but Thomas began to investigate the mansion's history. He discovered that Blackthorn Hall had once belonged to a reclusive alchemist named Victor Ashcroft, who was rumored to have dabbled in forbidden practices. They said he summoned something, Thomas muttered to himself, reading an old journal, something he couldn't control. Eleanor, meanwhile, became increasingly withdrawn. She confided in Samuel, telling him about the shadow she had seen watching her from the corner of her room. "It's not just a shadow," she whispered. "It's alive." Chapter 4. The Encounter. One stormy night, the family's fears came to a head. The mansion was plunged into darkness as a fierce wind rattled the windows. In the flickering glow of a single lantern, Thomas led his family to the study, where they huddled together. "We're leaving tomorrow," Margaret declared, her voice firm despite her trembling hands. But as she spoke, the temperature in the room dropped. A deep, resonant creak echoed through the hallways, followed by the sound of footsteps. Thomas grabbed the fireplace poker, his grip tightening as the footsteps grew louder. The family watched in terror as a dark figure emerged from the shadows. It was humanoid in shape, but its form was indistinct, shifting and writhing like smoke. "Who are you?" Thomas demanded, his voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised an amorphous hand, and the lantern's flame extinguished. In the suffocating darkness, Eleanor screamed. Chapter 5. The Revelation. The next morning, the family found themselves in the study, unsure of how they had survived the night. Thomas was determined to end the haunting once and for all. He returned to the alchemist's journal, searching for a way to banish the entity. "The shadow is bound to this house," he explained to his family. "Ashcroft's experiments created it, and it feeds on fear. If we confront it, we might weaken its hold." Reluctantly, the family agreed. That night, they gathered in the mansion's grand hall, armed with candles and resolve. As the clock struck midnight, the shadow appeared once more. Its form was larger now, its presence more oppressive. "We're not afraid of you," Eleanor said, stepping forward. Her voice was steady, though her heart raced. The shadow hesitated, its form flickering. Margaret joined her daughter, holding a candle aloft. "Leave this house," she demanded. "You have no power over us." One by one, the family confronted the entity, their combined courage forcing it to retreat. With a final, otherworldly wail, the shadow dissipated into the air, leaving the mansion eerily quiet. Epilogue. The Whitakers stayed in Blackthorn Hall for another week, ensuring that the shadow was truly gone. Though the mansion still bore its eerie aura, the oppressive fear had lifted. Thomas documented the events, vowing to share the story as a warning to others. Eleanor found solace in her bravery, while Samuel's curiosity turned to respect for the unknown. As they left the mansion for the final time, Margaret glanced back at the towering structure. "Some shadows," she said softly, "should never be disturbed." The blood-stained diary. The antique shop stood at the corner of a quiet street, its windows dusty and filled with relics of forgotten lives. Among the clutter of old clocks, tarnished jewelry, and weathered books sat a leather-bound diary. The cover was deep crimson, almost as if it had been soaked in blood. On its front, embossed in gold letters, were the words, "Do not open." Chapter 1. The Discovery. Ellie Grayson, a journalist with a penchant for uncovering dark stories, stumbled upon the diary while browsing the shop on a rainy afternoon. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with a crooked smile, eyed her warily as she picked it up. "That's not for sale," he said, his voice gravelly. Ellie smirked. "Everything has a price." The shopkeeper hesitated before naming a modest sum. "But I warn you, miss, that diary has a dark history. Keep it closed." Ellie, of course, ignored his warning. That evening, she sat at her desk with the diary in front of her, its ominous cover calling to her curiosity. With a deep breath, she opened it. The first page was blank. Then, in spidery handwriting, appeared the words, "To read is to invite the darkness." Chapter 2. The first entry. The diary's pages began to fill as if by magic, revealing entries written decades ago by a man named Charles Redmond. He described himself as an ordinary teacher in a small town, but his life took a dark turn when he stumbled upon a strange ritual in the woods. Ellie's pulse quickened as she read. Charles wrote about finding a group of hooded figures chanting around a fire, their voices weaving together a song that made the air hum. He described a shadow emerging from the flames, its eyes glowing like embers. That night, Ellie dreamed of the shadow. It stood at the foot of her bed, its gaze piercing and unrelenting. She woke with a start, her heart racing. The diary lay open on her desk, its pages fluttering despite the still air. Chapter 3. The Curse Revealed. Ellie became obsessed with the diary, reading it every chance she got. The entries grew darker, chronicling Charles's descent into madness. He spoke of hearing whispers in his home, of seeing the shadow in mirrors and dark corners. He tried to burn the diary, but it wouldn't catch fire. He tried to bury it, but it reappeared on his bedside table the next morning. The more Ellie read, the more she noticed the same phenomena happening to her. Whispers echoed in her apartment when she was alone. Shadows shifted in ways they shouldn't. One night, she caught a glimpse of something in her bathroom mirror, a figure standing just behind her. When she turned, no one was there. Chapter 4. The Price of Knowledge. Charles's final entries revealed the truth. The diary was cursed. It was a vessel for a malevolent entity that thrived on fear and despair. The more he wrote, the stronger the entity became, feeding off his dread until it consumed him entirely. Ellie tried to stop reading, but the diary seemed to compel her. Her hands moved on their own, flipping through its pages. One night, as she struggled to close it, new words appeared. You cannot escape. Finish the story. Ellie's phone rang, startling her. It was her best friend, MIA. Ellie, are you okay? You've been acting strange. Ellie hesitated. I'm fine, she lied. Come over, MIA insisted. I'm worried about you. Grateful for the distraction, Ellie grabbed the diary and headed to Mia's apartment. But as she walked through the empty streets, the whispers grew louder, forming words. Turn back. Chapter 5. The Final Confrontation. At Mia's apartment, Ellie explained everything. MIA, ever the skeptic, dismissed it as stress and overwork. It's just an old book, Ellie. You're letting your imagination run wild. Ellie opened the diary to show her friend, but the pages were blank. See, MIA said. There's nothing there. Frustrated, Ellie closed the diary and placed it on the coffee table. But as they sat in uneasy silence, the room grew cold. The lights flickered, and the diary flew open on its own. Words appeared in bold, jagged letters. You should not have brought her. The shadows in the room coalesced, forming the same figure Ellie had seen in her dreams. It towered over them, its presence suffocating. MIA screamed as the shadow lunged toward her. But Ellie grabbed the diary and shouted, "Take me instead." The shadow paused, its burning eyes fixed on Ellie. It reached out a hand, and the diary erupted in flames. The fire consumed the room, and Ellie's world went black. Epilogue. When Ellie woke, she was alone. The apartment was untouched, as if nothing had happened. The diary was gone, leaving no trace of its existence. But as Ellie stood, she noticed something in the mirror. Her shadow was no longer her own. It moved independently, its form darker and more menacing than ever. The whispers returned, louder than before. The story is never truly over. The Night Guest. The Midnight Pines Hotel was a forgotten relic, perched on the edge of a desolate highway. Its faded sign flickered weakly against the darkness, and its creaky wooden structure groaned with the weight of years. Travelers seldom stopped there, preferring the newer motels farther down the road. But for Raymond Carter, driving through a relentless storm with no end in sight, it was a haven. The clock behind the check-in desk read 11:48 p.m. when Raymond entered, shaking the rain from his coat. The lobby was eerily silent, save for the faint buzz of a fluorescent light overhead. The receptionist, an elderly man with sunken eyes, greeted him with a tight-lipped smile. "Room for the night?" the man asked, his voice gravelly. Raymond nodded. "Just one night." The receptionist hesitated, then slid a key across the counter. "Room 7. Last room down the hall." "And, Mr. Carter?" Raymond paused. "Yes." The man's expression darkened. "Don't open the door for anyone after midnight." Chapter 1. The First Encounter. Room 7 was small but clean, with an old-fashioned brass bed, a faded armchair, and a single window that rattled in the wind. Raymond unpacked his bag and settled into the chair, letting out a tired sigh. The storm raged outside, thunder rumbling like distant cannon fire. At precisely 12:03 a.m., there was a knock at the door. Raymond's heart skipped a beat. He remembered the receptionist's warning and stayed seated, staring at the door. The knock came again, louder this time. "Hello," a voice called out. It was a man's voice, deep and calm. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I think I'm in the wrong room." Raymond hesitated. "There's no mistake. This is my room." The voice grew insistent. "Please, just open the door. I won't take long." Raymond's instinct screamed at him to ignore it. After a tense moment, the knocking stopped, and the storm outside seemed to grow louder, drowning out everything else. Relieved, Raymond climbed into bed, but sleep did not come easily. Chapter 2. The Daylight Deception. The next morning, Raymond awoke to find the room exactly as he had left it. The receptionist greeted him with a thin smile as he checked out. "Quiet night?" the man asked. Raymond nodded but couldn't shake the unease from the night before. "There was someone at my door around midnight." "Who else is staying here?" The receptionist's smile faltered. "No one else. You were the only guest." Raymond's stomach churned. Maybe it was one of the staff. The man shook his head. "We don't bother our guests after hours." As Raymond drove away, the hotel disappeared into the distance, but the memory of that voice lingered. Chapter 3. The Return. Weeks later, Raymond found himself back on the same stretch of highway. Another storm loomed, and against his better judgment, he decided to stay at the Midnight Pines Hotel again. The receptionist gave him the same key and the same warning. Don't open the door for anyone after midnight. This time, Raymond prepared. He placed a chair against the door and kept the bedside lamp on. At exactly 12:03 a.m., the knocking returned. "Hello," the voice called. "It's me again. I'm sorry to bother you." Raymond clenched his fists. "Go away." The knocking grew more persistent. The voice became plaintive. "Please, let me in. I have nowhere else to go." Raymond stared at the door, his breath quickening. Suddenly, the lamp flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The knocking stopped, replaced by a scraping sound, as if nails were dragging across the wood. Chapter 4. The Truth Unveiled. The next morning, Raymond demanded answers. The receptionist's expression grew grave as he recounted the events. "Years ago," the man began, "there was a guest who stayed in room 7. He arrived during a storm, just like you. But when someone knocked on his door at midnight, he opened it." "What happened?" Raymond asked. The receptionist's gaze dropped to the counter. "They found him the next morning. He was dead, his body twisted as if he'd been struck by lightning. Since then, every guest in room 7 hears the knocking. And the voice." Raymond pressed. The man's eyes met his, filled with a mixture of fear and sorrow. "That's the spirit of the man who died. He's trapped, searching for someone to open the door and take his place." Chapter 5. The Final Night. Raymond resolved never to return, but fate had other plans. Months later, another storm forced him back to the Midnight Pines Hotel. Room 7 was the only one available. This time, he made a decision. He wouldn't just ignore the knocking. He would confront it. As the clock struck 12:03 a.m., the familiar knock echoed through the room. "Hello," the voice called, quieter now, almost pleading. Raymond approached the door, his hand trembling as he reached for the knob. He hesitated, then yanked the door open. There was no one there. A gust of icy wind rushed past him, extinguishing the light. The room grew unbearably cold, and the shadow of a man materialized in the doorway, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "Thank you," the voice whispered, echoing from everywhere and nowhere at once. Before Raymond could react, the shadow surged forward, and everything went black. Epilogue. The next morning, the receptionist found room 7 empty. The bed was untouched, and Raymond's belongings were gone. But the door to the room stood wide open, and on the floor was a single wet footprint, leading out into the hall and disappearing into nothingness. The Midnight Pines Hotel remained as it always had, waiting for its next guest.